Welcome back again to Textual Criticism of the New Testament. This is part 3. We're looking in a bit more detail at the sources that we can use for doing textual criticism of the New Testament Greek text. So briefly, we're going to look today at the distribution, both by age and by content, of the New Testament manuscripts. How old are these manuscripts? Where do they cluster as far as age is concerned? Do we have more manuscripts early? Do we have more manuscripts later? Then try to give an idea of the distribution by content. So which books do we have the most? Or which books are represented and by what number? And then finally, we're going to take a look at 4 of the big sources that we have for the New Testament text, the 4 great uncials. The earliest manuscripts that we have of the New Testament text come from the 2nd century. We have 2 papyri. The latest papyri that we have are in the 8th century. The uncials, minuscules, and the lectionaries, if you remember from our last video, these 3 all come together in with some regularity in the 9th century, and it's about the time of the papyri, obviously the latest papyri in the 8th century, so it's when the uncials, minuscules, and lectionaries are starting to take over. And the 11th through the 14th centuries show the greatest number of manuscripts extant, and of course that makes some logical sense, right? Because they're younger and so they're better preserved, whereas 1,800-year-old papyri, there aren't nearly as many. But that's sort of the distribution by age. The earliest come from the 2nd century. The papyri sort of run out in the 8th. We have minuscules, uncials, and lectionaries that are really picking up in the 9th century. But the bulk of our evidence is coming from the 11th to the 14th centuries. Now, when we think about their distribution by content, we have 3 uncials and 56 minuscules that contain the entirety of the New Testament text. 2 of the uncials and 147 minuscules have everything except the book of Revelation, which, given its transmissional history and its acceptance into the canon, is not terribly surprising. We have 1 uncial and 75 minuscules that have everything except the Gospels. And this sort of variation is common among the preserved manuscripts. And if you look at Alon's book, he gives a breakdown of many of the different variations, the combinations that exist, or what books are preserved where. So in general, with the Gospels, we have 2,361 manuscripts. We have 662 manuscripts of the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. The Pauline letters are preserved in 792 manuscripts. The book of Revelation, 287 manuscripts. Now, when we think about our major sources for the Greek New Testament, there are 4 that we need to consider. The first is Codex Alexandrinus. When we begin to do textual criticism, or when you start to do textual criticism on your own, you look at the apparatus, you're going to see that Codex Alexandrinus is represented by A, or Uncial 02. It's a 5th century manuscript, and it contains the entirety of the New Testament. Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus is represented as C, or Uncial 04. It is also a 5th century manuscript, and it contains the entirety of the New Testament text. Codex Sinaiticus is represented by the Hebrew letter Aleph, Uncial 01. It is a 4th century manuscript, so slightly earlier, and it contains the entirety of the New Testament text as well. Finally, Codex Vaticanus, represented as B, or 03, is a 4th century manuscript, and while it doesn't contain the entirety of the New Testament text, it has the Gospels through chapter 9, partway through chapter 9 of the book of Hebrews. So these are our 4 great uncials, very important for textual criticism. So, coming up, and I know I've been promising this, and I apologize. We're going to be looking at what I'm calling part 2 of using Alon's book to identify the manuscripts. The goal of tomorrow is to actually give you some working knowledge of how to use his book as a resource to identify New Testament manuscripts, be they uncials, minuscules, and papyri, lectionary, so forth. So stay tuned for that.